I will now present my dissertation entitled Meaning and Emotion. The dissertation is about different kinds of emotional meaning. That is, I study different constructs, different theoretical constructs, different concepts of meaning, and I see how I can apply them to understand what emotions mean. In the first part of my dissertation, I talk about allower meaning. And this is a concept that I've forged in this dissertation that I've introduced here. Then in chapters 5 and 6, I talk about speaker meaning and its role to emotion. Then I'll talk about coded meaning, probabilistic meaning, and telecoded meaning. And in chapter 9, I talk about what emotions themselves mean for the animal that undergoes the emotion. Okay, so let's go on with the first part, which is about allower meaning and which is the central notion of the extended Gricean model. This is a theory, a model that I've developed to account for information transfer, for information transmission, and that I've applied to emotions. So we are here, allower meaning. Let's begin with an example, Jane's crush on Maria. So Jane has a crush on Maria, and Maria suspects it. And Jane suspects that Maria suspects it. Okay, that's our context. Jane asks, "Are you going to the gig tonight?" And Maria answers, "I have to finish writing a paper by tomorrow." Jane sighs. She doesn't side with any communicative intention. She doesn't side in order to mean something. Anyway, even though she doesn't have this communicative intention, any communicative intention at all, when she sighs, Maria understands something from her sighs and answers accordingly. But we can hang out on Sunday if you like. So I think we can say that Jane's sigh, with the silence afterward, updates Jane and Maria's common background. And by common background, I mean something like the set of information, in a broad sense, that they can both take, that they are both warranted as taking to be mutually recognizable, publicly discernible, overt in their common background. So Jane's sigh updates the common background with 3 pieces of information in particular. First one is that Jane undergoes a negative affect because Maria isn't going to the gig. She confirms Maria's suspicion that she has a crush on her, and she seems not to mind that Maria believes that A and B. So Maria understands Jane's sigh to somehow transmit these pieces of information, and Jane should also be aware that she somehow transmits these pieces of information with her sigh. And that's what I want to try to explain. One way to put the problem is to ask the question, to what theories should we turn if we had to build a robot that can infer these pieces of information, assume that they are in the common background of Jane and Maria, and take this into account so as to respond adequately, just like Jane did when she said, "But we can hang out on Sunday if you like." All right, and to answer this question, we can turn to 2 types of models of information transmission that already exist in the literature. The code models, which is the first type, and the Gricean models, which is the second type, including neo and post-Gricean models. The Gricean models account for so-called Gricean meaning or pragmatic meaning or enriched meaning, while the code models are supposed to account for code-based meaning or semantic meaning or literal meaning. The code models is pretty simple. Are pretty simple. You have a sender that encodes pieces of information to a sign, and the receiver decodes these pieces of information from the sign. And they can do this thanks to a shared code. And the code consists of pre-established pairings between pieces of information and types of signs. So the Morse code is a conventional code, but we can postulate codes to study any type of communicative system. So for instance, you can study bacteria communication. With the code model, you say, okay, there are these bacteria that send these molecules to other bacteria, and they thereby transmit information because they encode certain pieces of information into the sign that travels to the other bacteria. And this is possible because they share somehow this pre-established pairing that allow them to decode what the molecules, the sign, transmit. Here, some notorious examples of codes that were postulated to study communication. For English, formal semantics is a powerful code that pairs, on the one hand, words and their order with, on the other hand, the information that is the semantic representation of the sentence. Emotional expression have been studied through code models. So for instance, Ekman has famously proposed that we can understand others' emotions through facial expressions, and thanks to a code that pairs patterns of facial expression with certain types of emotions. And last example, monkey alarm calls also have been studied through codes. Here, the monkeys emit signs that are paired with certain predators and with certain reactions that the monkeys should adopt when they hear these calls. Okay. But sometimes codes are not enough. Even though you can learn a lot from code models, sometimes they don't seem to be sufficient. So for instance, take this example from the dialogue that I've introduced before. Maria, at some point, she says, I have to finish writing a paper by tomorrow. So the relevant code here is English grammar and lexicon. And the code tells us that Maria has to finish writing a paper by tomorrow. But we understand much more from this utterance, right? We understand that Maria cannot go to the gig tonight. How do we do that? In other words, how do we communicate with implicatures? Implicatures being information sent without being encoded into the sign used. This is the notion that was developed by Paul Grice, from whom the Gricean model takes its name. All right. Well, Grice and his heirs have tried to answer this question by developing the prevailing Gricean models. And it's a bit more complicated than the code models. First, you have an encoding-decoding mechanism. And in this case, it's English grammar and lexicon that's relevant. It's the code that tells us that Maria has to finish writing her paper by tomorrow. But then there are other ingredients that the Gricean models add to this encoding-decoding mechanism. The first one is the display and recognition of communicative intentions. That is, we understand from Maria's utterance that she means something and that she wants us to recognize what she means, basically. Furthermore, because we recognize that Maria means something and wants us to recognize what she means, we expect her to respect some pragmatic principle of communication. For instance, we expect her to be relevant. We expect her to answer Jane's question and to answer it relevantly, because we recognize that she means something, that she wants to answer the question. That's the idea. And we do that thanks to the common background, the set of information that they can both take for granted, basically. Thanks to all these ingredients, we can mind read communicative intentions. That is, we can make hypotheses, we can make abductive inferences as to what people mean with the utterance or the other signs they use. In this case, we mind read that Maria cannot go to the gig tonight. That's how basically the prevailing Gricean models work. And of course, at the end, once you have mind read the communicative intentions, you can update the common background with the encoded and implicated information. And the communication can go on from this point with an updated common ground that is updated with the new information. Okay. Now, I argue in my dissertation that these two models cannot cover all information transmission. There is a blind spot. And in particular, this blind spot is there because sometimes there is information that is transferred where no codes are sufficient to account for the information that is transferred, but there is an absence of communicative intentions. So the code models is not sufficient, but the prevailing Gaussian models don't apply because the communicative intentions that are essential to the prevailing Gaussian model are absent. And so my proposal, in order to enlighten this blind spot, is to extend the Gaussian models by addressing what senders allow signs to mean beyond what they intend them to mean. And that's what the extended Gaussian model is about. It's about what senders allow signs to mean, as opposed to what they merely intend them to mean. And that's why I propose to use the notion of allower meaning instead of the notion of speaker meaning or of ostensive inferential communication, which are the central notion of the prevailing Gaussian models, which are notions that depend on these communicative intentions. Allower meaning doesn't. And because of that, I have to propose also another type of pragmatic principle, because the prevailing pragmatic principles are based on the expectation that you recognize communicative intentions. But that doesn't apply to certain cases of allower meaning. That's why I need to create this goal principle, which basically says something like, we tend to react in ways that are conducive to our goals. Seems pretty obvious. And because of that, we can make sense of how others act and react by rationalizing about their goals, by trying to figure out, okay, why did they act in that way? Let's make a hypothesis, given that I think they have these goals and these beliefs, basically. Okay, so now let us see how the extended Gaussian model can apply to the initial example, that is Jane's psi. Very briefly, of course, I don't have the time to go into the details. First, yes, there is this coding-decoding mechanism again. But in this case, the relevant code is what size encode. And size encodes affects, basically. Either positive affects like relaxation or relief, or negative ones like stress or pain or disappointment or sadness. Second, we can take into account the common background. In this case, what's very relevant here is that Jane likes Maria, and Jane sighed in response to Maria's to the news that Maria is not coming to the gig tonight. Because we react with negative affects to events that are praised as negative, generally, we can already infer that the affect undergone by Jane must be negative. Then an important ingredient of the extended Gaussian model is that Jane, with her psi, somehow allows certain thoughts in Maria. She allows her psi to generate certain thoughts, certain beliefs, certain hypotheses in Maria. Why? Well, because first of all, she didn't prevent herself from sighing. And if she couldn't prevent herself from sighing, she didn't either give excuses as to why she sighed. She could have said something like, wow, hearing about your work makes me stressed because I have all these things to do next week. Or I don't know, she could have invented some excuse in order to try to cancel some of the effects that she produced with her sigh, but she didn't try to cancel any of those. If she really wanted not to transmit certain pieces of information, if she really wanted to cancel some of the thoughts, some of the beliefs, some of the hypotheses that she created with her psi, she would have canceled them. She would have tried to cancel them, at least. She would have prevented herself from saying or given some excuse, but she didn't. So probably, first of all, Jane, so because of that, she confirms Maria's suspicion that she has a crush on her, and she probably does not mind that Maria believes that A and B, that is that she undergoes a negative effect and that she confirms the suspicion. And these were the three types of information we wanted to account for. Now, these pieces of information can be used to update the common background because all of this is in the common background. It's available to both Jane and Maria, and Jane allowed this to be available. Okay, and that's how basically Jane's psi is explained through the lens of the extended Gaussian model. Now, in the dissertation, I use several other types of examples. Actually, I don't use these examples, but I use similar examples with respect to emotional expressions. But I also apply the extended Gaussian model to, for instance, unintentional messages that we send by how we dress. So sometimes we dress without intending to send certain messages, but nevertheless, we allow the way we dress to send certain messages. We may use offensive expressions without offensive intentions, but nevertheless allow the use of this offensive expression to have to generate an offensive meaning. We allow these expressions to mean something offensive, even though we didn't intend them to mean something offensive. And I also have a chapter on the meaning of narrative artworks and how we might want to try to interpret narrative artworks through this framework by studying what authors allow their works to mean as opposed to what they intend their works to mean. And I studied the very deep question, is Dumbledore gay? Those who have a knowledge of J.K. Rowling will understand why this question is relevant. And I also study a scene in Game of Thrones that I think is sexist, has a sexist meaning, even though the authors didn't intend it to be sexist. I think they allowed it to be sexist. Okay, so that was for the first part of the dissertation. Let me now turn to chapters 5 and 6, emotion and speaker meaning. So we move away from allower meaning into speaker meaning. So speaker meaning, once again, is the meaning that we intend that we intend to communicate. That's the meaning that's at the center of the prevailing Gaussian models. In particular, I ask what's the difference between utterances that are expressive of emotions or affects versus utterances that are descriptive of emotions or of affects. In other words, I will say expressives and descriptives. So for instance, what's the difference between somebody screaming outrageous versus somebody saying on a neutral tone, I feel outraged by what the government did? Or versus somebody saying ouch versus somebody saying I feel a great pain. Well, following after a review of the literature, I think there are three main distinguishing features, at least. Expressives can be said to be hot somehow, while descriptives are cold. Expressives are directly show emotions, while descriptives indirectly report them. Expressives can be said to be appropriate or inappropriate, merited or unmerited, but we cannot say that they are literally true or false. So for instance, ouch is not literally true or false, but it can be appropriate or inappropriate somehow. But if you say, I feel a great pain, this can be literally true or false. And I say that these three distinguishing features can be grounded in a theory of emotion, basically. In other words, I say, if emotions or affects are felt bodily evaluative attitudes, we can ground the features distinguishing expressives from descriptives in features distinguishing emotions from beliefs or affects from doxastic attitudes more generally. Why? Well, because emotions, as opposed to beliefs, can be said to be hot in the sense that they have a very salient phenomenology, a way it feels like to understand, to undergo them. So we feel our body prepared to act, we feel positive or negative, pleasant or unpleasant feelings, etc. There's this hot phenomenology to emotions, but that's not true for beliefs. Emotions, if there are bodily attitudes, then we can directly see them, perceive them. They are directly shown through the body or through the voice, but beliefs are, cannot be directly shown in that way. They are indirectly reported rather. Furthermore, emotions can be said to be appropriate or inappropriate, merited or unmerited to the situation, by the situation, but they cannot be said to be true or false like beliefs can be said to be literally true or false. And that's why we can ground these distinguishing features from expressives and descriptives in the differences between emotions and beliefs. In the next chapter, I ask, what does it take to optimally understand an expressive? So now I take the perspective of the audience and I ask, okay, as an audience, what does it take to really optimally understand an expressive? And I present 3 views. The first one is doxasticism, and it says basically that to optimally understand an expressive, it is necessary and sufficient to attribute the right doxastic attitude, the right belief, for instance, to the speaker. So you would optimally understand the expressive outrageous if you correctly believe that the person thinks that what the government did is wrong, for instance. Moderate affectivism says, no, that cannot be true because beliefs are so different from doxastic attitudes are so different from affects, beliefs are so different from emotions that merely ascribing a belief to the utterer is not enough to understand really what the utterer means. So you cannot understand really what somebody saying outrageous means if you merely ascribe a belief to this person as opposed to an emotion. And radical affectivism goes further somehow and says, well, actually, what's really important is to undergo affective resonance toward the speaker, to undergo a corresponding, affect in response to the affect expressed by the speaker. So if somebody says, ouch, and you undergo some empathy toward the speaker, you can really affectively resonate with her emotions, with her pain, in this case, maybe not an emotion. And through this affective resonance, you really get what the person is saying. And I claim that perhaps first of all, affectivism, moderate or radical, is better than doxasticism. And perhaps the radical version is the best account. Which, by the way, would make it very hard to build a robot that could understand optimally understand expressives, because it would be very hard to create a robot that could undergo affective resonance. Okay. Next, I turn to chapter 7 and 8 and the topic of emotion and code-based meaning. Code-based meaning is this one, and it's the type of meaning that need not be accounted through a Gricean model. So it doesn't require the mind-reading abilities based on the pragmatic principles that are common to all the Gricean models. And in particular, I ask, how can natural science encode information about emotions? For instance, how can we understand what this guy is undergoing or pretending to undergo? In particular, how do we understand that this guy may be feeling disgust, for instance? And a simple theory says, if someone displays a certain sign, X, then she undergoes a certain type of emotion, E. So if you display this face, you undergo disgust. But this cannot be right because the same sign in different contexts may be used to express different emotions. So here you have the same disgust face that expresses disgust or anger or sadness or fear, depending on the context. So this theory is no good for us. The second notion that I evaluate is that of probabilistic meaning, and it's a bit more sophisticated. It says that the presence of the sign X raises the probability that S undergoes a certain emotion. And it works well for non-communicative signs. And so it's a very useful notion to study non-communicative signs. By that, I mean, for instance, pupil dilatation, heart rate increase, blood pressure increase, breathing rate increase or breathing deepness increase. All of those signs are not meant to be communicative, and they can be usefully studied through this notion of probabilistic meaning. You can say, okay, if the person has this sign, she probably undergoes an affect, she probably is affectively aroused. But it doesn't work well for communicative signs, I argue, for signs that have a communicative function. So for example, the vervet monkey alarm call is a call that emitted by vervet monkeys that means something like, let us assume, an eagle is present, I am so afraid of the eagle, and hide in the bushes. And one problem with probabilistic meaning is that is the rare eagle scenario. A scenario where, for instance, because of climate change, you can say eagles have disappeared from an area, and monkeys, even the youngsters that have never seen eagles in their life, may understand the vervet monkey eagle alarm call to mean these three things, although it's not the case anymore that this call raises the probability that, for instance, an eagle is present. So it cannot at least account for this part. And it has also other problems that I don't have the time to discuss here. Now, that's why we need to turn to another notion to account for communicative signs. And that's the notion of telecoded meaning that I propose based on other teleosemantic notions. And I define it as such. The telecoded meaning of a signal consists in the information that is encoded in the signal, that the signal has a function to convey, and this notion of function is very important here, and it is itself explained because this function is explained as being the result of genetic or cultural evolution, as opposed to a function that is intentionally ascribed. So for instance, this is related to other teleosemantic notions. And it has the advantages of avoiding the problems of probabilistic meaning. It's safe from stats in the sense that even in the case of the rare eagle scenario, the signal can preserve its function. And it also avoids the other problems. So at this point in the dissertation, we have seen all the types of, all the kinds of meaning, all the kinds of notions that I think are useful to study emotions. The meaning of emotions, emotional meaning. And in the last chapters, I turned to what emotions represent, what they mean by themselves somehow to the person or the animal undergoing the emotion. And I start with a standard view in affective sciences about paradigmatic emotional episodes. The standard view says basically that we have an emotion when there is a stimulus that is either perceived or imagined or inferred or remembered that goes through somehow an appraisal process. And the appraisal process is a cognitive process of categorizing the stimulus as, for instance, obstructive to one's goal. So for instance, a stimulus may be appraised as obstructive to one's safety, as dangerous, as a threat. And this cause in turn action tendencies. You may want to run from stimuli that you appraised as obstructive to your safety, which in turn require some physiological and motor reactions. So in order to run, our body is well done, and it will, if we appraise the stimulus as a threat, start pumping more blood, release more adrenaline that will stop the digestion, which will help us run away from the stimulus and all other kinds of changes. And at the end of this process, we have the emotional feeling. So that means that steps 1 to 4 are extremely fast, automatic, we don't deliberately make them, and unconscious. And at the end, very quickly, we have the emotional feeling. All right. quickly, why do we need this appraisal process? Well, to explain how we can have different emotions with respect to the same kinds of stimuli, or the same kind of emotion with respect to different kinds of stimuli. And it does so by saying that the person who is, for instance, afraid of a mouse in the kitchen as opposed to angry that there is a mouse in the kitchen, categorize the mouse as a threat, as obstructive to her safety, while the person that is angry at the mouse may categorize it as some stimulus that is trespassing some norm that needs to be toward which we need to react aggressively. And furthermore, both people undergoing aesthetic admiration toward the rose and the dance categorize them somehow as, say, beautiful. Now, I use this notion of representation that I take from Drudzky that says that a system represents naturally a property when if and only if it has a function to indicate that property, the natural function. And I say that the appraisal process represents evaluative properties, at least properties such as goal obstructiveness and goal conduciveness. And because of that, the appraisal process, because the appraisal process has the natural function of indicating these properties to the organism. And for that reason, we can say that emotions represent evaluative properties, positive and negative properties, and they do so unconsciously through the appraisal process, which is unconscious as I interpret this series. All right. So I reached the conclusion. Finally, an emotional sign can possess a probabilistic meaning, a telecoded meaning, a speaker meaning, and an allower meaning. And that's pretty awesome because just one single sign, just this guy, for instance, can, incarnate somehow all these types of meanings. So affective meaning is extremely complex, but it's also extremely intuitive in the sense that we understand it so quickly without thinking about it. It's quite impressive. And that makes it also very hard to study emotional meaning, very hard to create a robot that could understand emotions. Although I hope with this dissertation to have made some progress in this direction. Thank you very much for your attention.